This series discusses crime scenes, details from autopsy and skeletal analysis, discussion of drug use, and references to historic reports that may use outdated language regarding a variety of social issues, including topics like immigration, housing insecurity, and sex work. There is specific discussion of drug use and brief mention of suicide and self-harm in this episode. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. Through 3 episodes now, we've covered the John and Jane Does of Nashville, cases of the unidentified who've died by homicide, by natural causes or accident, possible overdose, and by undetermined means. We've discussed the difficulty in reconnecting a person to their identity when they've been deceased for some time. This episode, we're looking at cases of John and Jane Does who seem like they should have been identified because they were discovered very soon after death. Each of these identifications is faced with its own challenges, but we hope, with the continued support of our listening audience, who can circulate these episodes and the flyers that we've made for the cases, new leads may come up that can help reconnect these victims with their identities. Back in episode 2, when we covered victims who may have been part of the unhoused community of Nashville, we told you that there were still a few more stories left to tell. Of the John and Jane Doe cases we're covering today, several of the victims were either known to be or may have been unhoused. We've discussed the extra layers of difficulty that can come in identifying a person who's been living without permanent ties to an address or who may not have an extensive digital footprint. The sad thing is, we know that there are people who could help identify these victims, perhaps living or working within blocks of where they were discovered, but there's no way to establish a link between a decedent and where they worked without ID or the lucky find of a pay stub. Other members of the community and workers at shelters and outreach groups, they could help too, but it's a matter of finding the right people with the right information, and if a story is not widely covered, there's a good chance that those with the vital information, they'll never see it. It's also possible that victims are from out of state or newly immigrated to the United States, people whose loved ones are looking, but may have no idea where to start. The first case we want to tell you about is also one of the oldest that we were asked to cover, a man whose cause of death is known because it was witnessed. In fact, the discovery of his grievously injured body was reported within minutes, but it wasn't enough to help law enforcement discover his name. Back in 1993, Nashville looked much different than it does today. That's no surprise to our listeners. Buildings are gone and rebuilt, street names have changed, businesses have moved. So, when we needed to understand the layout of the Nashville Main Library branch as it was back then, we reached out to the current staff, because it was important to understanding the case of an unidentified man who died back in 1993. When we spoke to a current archivist, she explained that in 1993, the library was located in the Ben West building at the corner of 8th Avenue North, now Rosa Parks Boulevard. It's actually still standing today, though it's privately owned. The archivist told us that one side of the building faces the parking lot, and that on that side, the building's wall creates a sharp, high wall, a drop basically to the parking lot below. And according to the library's archivist, that drop is probably 20 or 30 feet. This information lines up with what we found in the 1993 police report that a man had fallen from a high wall at the Nashville Public Library facing the parking lot. The archival expert explained that the building featured a pedestrian walkway area, also above the parking lot where people might congregate. As a library staff member who was employed with the system at that time explained, the area was a comfortable place to rest. So, about the accident. It was August 7th, 1993, and still hot in Nashville. On the day of the accident, some unhoused residents had congregated outside the building near that high wall. The Metro Nashville PD officer had been called to the scene by emergency services, who'd received report of an injury, specifically that an individual had fallen from a high wall on the parking lot side of the building. It's unclear based on the summary of the statement as to whether witnesses actually saw the man's fall or just the aftermath. But the witnesses told police that, until the man fell, they hadn't been aware that he'd been sitting up on the pedestrian parkway area of the wall at all. When emergency services arrived at the scene, they discovered a critically injured white male. They quickly put him into an ambulance and carried him to Vanderbilt Hospital for treatment. The victim himself carried no identification, and as he was unconscious, they couldn't ask him any questions. And when law enforcement spoke with the witnesses at the scene, they said that they were unfamiliar with the victim. Later, the man, who we'll refer to as the 8th Avenue John Doe, died at the hospital without ever regaining consciousness. Unfortunately, the file does not contain information regarding possible interviews with local outreach services who may have known him or other members of the unhoused community, and there's no forensic art available in this case. So, when we spoke with Detective Matthew Filter, we asked whether there was any further insight that he could provide to our audience. With so little information available, do you think that we can definitively say the fall was an accident?
Unfortunately, with this case, very little information is available. According to the other unhoused individuals in the area, they didn't even know he was there. So, without any witnesses or surveillance video, it is hard to say how he fell off the wall.
And do you have any further information available as to his physical description that we could include?
He was a white male, estimated to be between 45 and 60 years of age, about 5 foot 10 inches tall and 188 pounds. He had red hair with a mustache and beard. He also had lost all of his teeth prior to death.
Though the 8th Avenue John Doe was discovered just minutes after his fall, the lack of information in his file and the difficulty in following up 3 decades later made it almost impossible to currently investigate his death. We couldn't find any news coverage, though there certainly may have been some broadcast that we simply don't have access to. But that's where forensic investigative genetic genealogy gives departments a way to solve cases that might otherwise be indefinitely stalled. Metro Nashville PD have submitted 8th Avenue John Doe's case for testing, but they are currently waiting for funding so they can proceed. We don't have any further details than the ones that have been shared with you: his race, hair color, approximate age, and that he'd lost all his teeth by the time he passed away. But perhaps there is a missing persons report out there somewhere that can be matched and can reconnect him to his loved ones. We have significantly more information to offer in the next case that we're covering this episode. It's more recent, from November of 2020, and again concerns an unidentified victim who was found while still recognizable. It was Thanksgiving Day, 2020, that was November 26th, and in a vacant house on Highway 70, a young woman's body was found in an upstairs bedroom. According to Metro Nashville PD files, police were called to the scene by a witness who'd come to the house looking for shelter. Reportedly, he said that, quote, he'd heard that the house was a place homeless can stay to get out of the cold, and that's why he came to the property. When he entered the home, he discovered, quote, the victim upstairs, and she looked to be cold and stiff. When emergency services and Metro Nashville police arrived, they found clear signs that people had been living in the home, though no one was present then except the victim, who was pronounced dead at 10:31 p.m. that evening. And the witness was right. She'd been dead for hours. The victim appeared to be a white female between 20 and 25 years of age, and she was found without clothing. According to Metro Nashville files, the victim's toxicology report showed a number of different substances in her system. As WKRN reported, quote, investigators believe that she died from an accidental drug overdose, though that could not be absolutely established. But there were no other clear signs as to what could have caused her death. And while the presence of the unopened Narcan package at her side certainly indicated that someone else could have been in the home and had perhaps even thought to try and revive her, it's not anything that we can prove. As police noted, there were signs that people had been staying there, and the witness who discovered the Highway 70 Jane Doe's body told them that the house was a known place to shelter from the cold. And as for the victim's description, we've already told you her approximate age, 20 to 25. She had brown hair, brown eyes, was about 5'4", and approximately 220 pounds. She had some syringe marks, likely from drug use, on her arms. Listeners are surely aware that fentanyl overdoses have been a serious concern for years now, and that the death rate from fentanyl far exceeds any other substance users may have encountered on the streets. In fact, people may encounter fentanyl cut into drugs that aren't opioids. For instance, fentanyl-laced cocaine can enter a city and kill a dozen people in a weekend. It happened here in Atlanta just a few years back, and that's just one of the stories that made headlines. And even when someone is purposely using fentanyl, dosing is a concern. The strength of the drug means that overdose from fentanyl and other synthetic opioids may be much more likely than from heroin. And according to a September 2023 article from WKRN, Davidson County, home to Nashville, has, quote, the second highest overdose rate in the United States. The death toll in 2022 was 754 people. A local medical officer, Dr. Chapman Sledge, told reporters that, quote, he found the news shocking. I assume that what we're dealing with here, locally, is what everybody else is dealing with. Fentanyl has become so incredibly pervasive everywhere in this country. According to the Nashville Scene, Davidson County does have a government-run harm reduction program called STARS that aims to put leave-behind kits in the hands of citizens who have survived overdoses. There's also naloxone available for distribution from a number of local organizations. In November of 2020, when the Highway 70 Jane Doe passed away, it was a particularly perilous time for substance users in Davidson County and across the United States. Because of the isolation due to COVID and strained resources, people were more likely to die alone. According to the CDC, overdose deaths rose by 30% during what they described as, quote, the early months of the COVID-19 epidemic, or March through December of 2020. The Highway 70 Jane Doe's death fell squarely during that period of strained resources, isolation, and illness. Perhaps all three of those issues had come into play for the Highway 70 Jane Doe. We don't know for sure that she lacked access to housing, but because of where she was found, an abandoned home where people sought shelter, it's a fair guess. People who were there around the same period, they may have known something about her, but again, they may not have. The fear of illness may have kept people apart, and so far, no one has come forward to share any information. No identification or personal items that might help identify her were found in the home. But she did have a tattoo that people who knew her would certainly recognize, a semicolon on her left wrist, except instead of being the classic semicolon, the period or circle portion of the semicolon was replaced with a red heart. It is fairly distinctive. Many of you are probably familiar with semicolon tattoos. They've taken on a new meaning for some people over the past decade. Popularized by the Semicolon Project, the semicolon has become recognizable as a symbol for both suicide prevention and mental health awareness, and has expanded for some to include substance use, self-harm, and other issues people face. According to Project Semicolon, quote, in writing, the semicolon is used to connect two related but independent thoughts. Symbolically, the semicolon tattoo represents the idea of continuation in life's journey, even in the face of adversity. It serves as a reminder that life does not end with a period, but rather continues with the strength to move forward and grow. The heart variation of the semicolon tattoo is popular, although perhaps slightly less so than the classic semicolon. And based on the victim's tattoo, which was healed but still very vivid, the tattoo did not seem to be very old. It is a popular design, but it's possible that the artist might remember doing it if they also got a description of the victim and saw her forensic art. And in this case, there is forensic art. It's posted on our social media right now, along with a photo of the victim's tattoo. When we spoke with Detective Filter about this case, we discussed a number of things, including why, with such a clear victim description, art, and the information about her tattoo, the victim has still not been identified. It seems like this is one of those cases where the victim might be easily identifiable. What do you think are the factors that have made it harder for Metro Nashville to connect her to her identity?
I don't have an answer for that. We've had other cases where the decedent was very recognizable, but yet no one came forward to say they knew the person. The only identifiable characteristic of her is her tattoo. Her tattoo and a recent forensic rendering of her face has been circulated through the local media, news, and put out on social media. It's possible she's from out of state, as no one locally has claimed to know her.
So, based on the medical examiner's report, it seems like she may have died from a drug overdose, but they could not be sure. What other possible causes of death have you considered? Do you think that there could be witnesses who might not have been found or contacted, thinking specifically of the Narcan that was found near her body? Is there any reason to believe or consider that that could have been left by someone who was going to attempt to revive her?
I think it is very possible others were in the house when she died. The house was abandoned and used mostly by the unhoused for shelter. There was evidence throughout the house that the house was used to do drugs in. There also appeared to be someone else that was sleeping next to her at some point.
As Detective Filter pointed out, though the Narcan may have belonged to the Highway 70 Jane Doe, there's no way she could have possibly planned to administer it to herself in case of possible overdose. That's simply not how Narcan works. So it seems very possible that someone was with her near the time of her death, or soon after, someone who wanted to try and help her, and discovered it was too late. If someone does have information about her identity, they can share that without fear of getting in trouble. There is an anonymous tip line that anyone can call. We'll share that information at the end of our episode, and you can find it right now in our show notes. Highway 70 Jane Doe may be a missing person from Tennessee, but it's just as likely that she may be from out of state. So far, she has not matched with any missing persons reports that Metro Nashville PD can find, but that does not mean that her loved ones aren't looking. They may simply believe that she's alive out there somewhere, but not in contact. So Metro Nashville needs your help in spreading her information. They've begun the process of seeking forensic investigative genetic genealogy in her case, but that course of action is still pending funding. One of the most disturbing cases that Metro Nashville PD brought to us also concerns what may be an accidental death, a case dating back to December of 2003. For the South, it was cold that month, with temperatures dipping into the mid-30s. It wasn't snowing, but it would have been a difficult time to be sleeping outside, whether in an encampment or in a vehicle in Nashville. As we told you in episode 2 of the series, Nashville's unhoused community has steadily increased over the last 30 years as the cost of housing has sharply risen, and services available simply are not enough to meet the needs of the population. We are not sure that the victim found in December of 2003 was unhoused. There are too many unanswered questions. But, as you'll hear, it seems that if he had many connections in Nashville, connections outside the unhoused community, who were unable to identify him, no one has come forward. According to Metro Nashville files, on December 11, 2003, a terrible discovery was made at a local cardboard processing plant on River Hill Road. A worker who was operating a Bobcat forklift was tasked with moving large bales of cardboard. As he lifted a large pile of compressed cardboard, he discovered something horrifying: the body of a man. The victim appeared to be a Hispanic or Latino male between 30 and 40 years of age and with a goatee-style black beard. He was dressed in gray cargo-style pants, black slip-on shoes, a dark gray or black long-sleeve shirt or sweatshirt with a tattoo-style design on the front, and a blue fleece vest. Overall, not really warm enough clothing for the weather. According to police notes, the man was carrying a ring of keys with a car key and a residence key in his pocket. According to a 2003 article from the Tennessean, police eventually determined that the victim had not been killed at the cardboard facility plant. By tracking the facility trucks and deliveries, they discovered that the victim had been, quote, inside a recycling container for cardboard behind a Murfreesboro Pike restaurant when a truck picked up the bin around 5 a.m. At the time this article was published, a police spokesman told reporters that, quote, the victim died when his pelvis was crushed by the truck. And per the Tennessean, the victim was not carrying any ID, but he did have the keys that we mentioned, and had one other identifying item, a, quote, short, multicolored plastic necklace that he wore around his neck. As far as we can tell, the Murfreesboro Pike John Doe didn't receive much news coverage at the time his body was discovered, despite the horrific circumstances. Detective Filter told us that the department does make sure to circulate bilingual announcements in many of their cases, most often in Spanish, but many other languages are important for communication in Nashville crime too. But we can't tell, at this point, how far that information may have traveled back in 2003. Based on information available to us in the case file, it seems that no one came forward with any tips or leads back in 2003, and we were struck by that, particularly because of the keys that the victim carried. We wondered if they might have tied him to people and places who should have recognized him. We also wondered if there might be multiple reasons why he might have been in the dumpster at the time that it was picked up by the truck. Could he have been seeking shelter? Certainly. But he also could have been dumpster diving, or he might have been placed there by someone else. With car keys and residency keys, should we assume that he'd been seeking shelter at all? We asked Detective Filter for his thoughts on all these issues. We have a person who was found so soon after death that they could theoretically be easier to identify. And in this particular instance, he had car keys and keys to a residence in his pocket. Would those keys have made him easier to identify?
With this case, too, it is possible the decedent was homeless. You would think that if somebody's got keys, especially to some kind of residence, you would think that they would have a place, but the keys could potentially have been to a family member's house or something, or in the sense of car keys, there's a lot of unhoused people that have cars, but in this particular case, I mean, it's really hard to tell whether he was an unhoused individual or not.
And is tracing keys something that is more difficult than the average person might imagine?
I think it is more so today. I know you can go to locksmiths and they can usually tell you at least the type of key that it would, what kind of key it would go to. And some keys do have codes on them, and they can look that information up and tell you exactly what it goes to. But for the most part, the keys are only going to be able to tell you that it's for, a residential key or a business key or car key or something like that, or a locker key, etc.
Are there any theories as to why he might have been in the dumpster? Could he have been placed there?
No, I'm not sure why he was in a dumpster. If he was unhoused, it is possible he climbed into the dumpster to try and stay warm. The medical examiner ruled his cause of death as mechanical asphyxia. Based on the cardboard that was found around him, they believe he came from a location on Murfreesboro Road. He likely was crushed when the truck emptied the dumpster and then compacted the cardboard.
Without a toxicology report in the file, we can't say if the Murfreesboro Pike John Doe was intoxicated or in a state where, perhaps, he would not have noticed the truck. There's even the possibility that he could have been placed in the dumpster alive, though we have no proof of that. Though he is currently up for forensic investigative genetic genealogy, we need to circulate his information throughout Tennessee and the United States. Like any of the other John and Jane Does we've featured in these episodes, he may have family living far from Tennessee and possibly outside the United States. We do have one thing to offer, which may be helpful in the Murfreesboro Pike John Doe's case. We reached out to forensic artist Carl Koppelman. You may be familiar with his work from the DNA Doe Project, and he also did the forensic artwork for the woman formerly known as Jane Doe, who was featured in my book, Lay Them to Rest. Carl was kind enough to offer his services and connected with Detective Matthew Filter to work on forensic art for this victim's case and for the next case we're presenting as well. As of this recording, Carl has completed his artwork in both cases, a huge benefit, because people will be much more likely to share information when they see art. Metro Nashville will be sharing that, and we'll circulate the art as well on our flyers, and hope that you will too. We'll have them prepared in both Spanish and English. There was some media coverage of the final case that we're bringing you today, but sadly, it did not bring in any significant tips to police. It also offered no answers as to why the victim made his way onto Highway I-24 in January of 2007. According to the Tennessean, on Monday, January 1st, 2007, a 21-year-old Antioch resident was in a terrible accident on Interstate 24. According to the police, it was early Monday morning when a pedestrian suddenly crossed, quote, the eastbound lanes of I-24 near Hickory Hollow Parkway in front of the resident's vehicle. According to the Tennessean, that pedestrian was, quote, hit in the left lane on the interstate by the 21-year-old Antioch resident who was traveling east. Though the driver had a small amount of alcohol prior to driving, it was within legal limits. And after extensive investigation, it was ruled that the driver was not at fault. By all accounts, the pedestrian had, literally, darted out across the highway, and the driver could not have avoided the accident. Based on the description of the scene, the pedestrian victim seems to have actually come from the left side of the highway, from the retainer wall, and not from the open right side of the road. It's unclear if he'd already crossed the westbound side of I-24. Much of the police file on this case is related to the accident itself, likely because investigators had to determine whether a homicide had occurred, but they were unable to discover much about the person who had been killed on I-24. According to Metro Nashville PD reports, the accident occurred around 3 a.m., when the victim was variously described as moving swiftly or even running into the road. There's no indication that he was purposely aiming to be hit by a car, but also no clear reason why he would be on the highway at such a late hour. As soon as the accident occurred, the driver pulled over to the left side of the road, against the retainer wall, and a witness called police. When authorities arrived on the scene, they found the crash and the victim deceased. They shut down multiple lanes of East I-24 so that they could conduct their investigation and question both the driver and the witness who'd called in the crash. The I-24 John Doe had died on or soon after impact. He was described as, quote, a Hispanic or Latino male, 20 to 25 years old, and about 5'5". He was about 150 pounds and was dressed in jeans, a white t-shirt, a brown belt, and white Fila tennis shoes, underdressed for the weather, which was cold that night at about 40 degrees. The I-24 John Doe had short black hair, brown eyes, and was carrying a pack of cigarettes. He also had a piece of paper in his pocket with a phone number written on it. Unfortunately, the paper became ripped during the accident, and only a partial number remained. We don't have access to even the partial number, but a name, probably M-E-N-O, with no tilde noted over the N, was written with the number. After speaking to a number of Spanish speakers, we were told that Mano is a popular nickname for a number of names, including Filomeno, but that Mano or Maño is also a first name, so there are a lot of possibilities. We also have no idea if the phone number was a local one, an out-of-state number, or even an international number. He could have been carrying other items too, but investigators couldn't be sure. Though they shut down the highway to perform a search, and they were able to recover items, such as his shoes, which were displaced at impact, other very small belongings could have been thrown so far that they may have been unrecoverable. But perhaps the most distinctive and important clue in the I-24 John Doe's case involves two other names. Investigators discovered that the young man had a distinctive tattoo on his chest. The tattoo features a heart with 3 banners wrapping around it, and behind the heart is a stemmed flower, probably a rose. On the banners, there are the words Jamie, mi amor, Sandra. In the background on the heart and between the first and second banner is the letter Y, or E, meaning and in Spanish. So, Jamie and my love, Sandra. Note that it's Jamie and not Jaime. It is a good guess that the victim is named or nicknamed Jamie, but it's also possible that it could be the name of another important loved one, a child, or another family member. It is certain that the names are meaningful to the victim, and they could go a long way toward identifying him. It's difficult to tell how old this tattoo is, but it is certainly fully healed, and we think that the artist who did the tattoo would definitely recognize it. When we spoke with Detective Filter, we asked if he could give us any insight as to why someone might cross the interstate at that particular point. Do you have any thoughts as to why the victim might have been on the highway? Is there a common crossing area to reach a residential area or a shopping center, gas station, etc.?
There's no reason anyone should have been trying to cross the interstate. My only thought was perhaps he was walking back to some location and he felt the interstate was the easiest way to get there. But why he was walking into the lanes of traffic is unknown. He was intoxicated, but also had a pretty high amount of cocaine in the system. I mean, that used to be a big thing. Take a hit of cocaine, or even today, methamphetamine is a little bit more common, but you take a hit of that stimulant and you're able to drink more and drink longer. So his blood alcohol would have been about 0.17. It's over twice the legal limit. He was a little bit smaller, but even still, I mean, 0.17. I'm sure he was feeling the effects of it for sure, but I don't think he would have been sloppy drunk. And with the cocaine metabolite, I mean, I would say he was probably balanced out.
So, there's no clear indication as to why the victim was crossing the highway, and even whether he realized the danger. We can't say for sure how much his substance use might have affected his judgment that night. And if he was with friends earlier in the day who may have been drinking with him or using cocaine, it's possible that they were reticent to come forward for fear of investigators. But Metro Nashville stressed to us that they are not interested in arresting anyone who helps them to identify unidentified persons. If a community member is a substance user or may be concerned about their legal status in the United States or has any other concerns, they can leave a message on the anonymous tip line, and that goes for any of the cases that we have discussed. There are translators available to listen to those messages and give the information to authorities, and tipsters do not have to leave their names. In the cases of all of the victims we've discussed today, Metro Nashville just wants to see the unidentified reconnected to their names and to their families, and we all know how difficult that can be to achieve. In the case of the I-24 John Doe, tips were few and far between. After police began to investigate the victim's identity and could find no immediate leads, his physical description and tattoo were circulated in English and Spanish-speaking media. More recently, the same information has been recirculated on social media as well, with no clear leads. We have no information as to whether the victim may have been in Tennessee for any length of time or whether he was just passing through. He may have had relatives outside the state or the country who are still looking for him to this day. His tattoo will be circulating again soon via our social media and Metro Nashville, along with Carl Koppelman's art. Carl has also made sure that the tattoo was prominently featured in his new forensic artwork. There is FIGG on the table for this victim's case, but the funding is not there yet, so we absolutely need your help sharing his information. We have bilingual posters available for sharing on our social media, and we hope that Carl's talent will catch the eyes of a bigger audience and encourage them to share, too. The cases that we have presented this episode are some of the most frustrating to us, and that we feel so passionately that they can and will be solved, if only they can be circulated widely enough. These victims are missing people, or disconnected people, people who have roots and families, and people who wonder where they are. We know this for certain because we've seen it ourselves. Unidentified people are missing people. We need to connect those cases together, and we can do that with your help. So please, help us circulate this information, particularly if you have access to bilingual social media communities. It could solve a cold case. If you have any information regarding the 4 cases we covered in today's episode, the 8th Avenue John Doe, a middle-aged white male with red hair and a red beard, who lost his teeth during life, the Highway 70 Jane Doe, who was a young white woman with brown hair and eyes and a semicolon tattoo, the Murfreesboro Pike John Doe, an adult Hispanic or Latino male with a goatee and black hair and brown eyes, and the I-24 John Doe, a young Hispanic or Latino male with black hair, brown eyes, and a tattoo reading Jamie y mi amor Sandra on his chest. Please listen closely. You can contact Detective Filter at Metro Nashville Police at 615-862-7803. You can also contact Nashville Crime Stoppers at 615-74-CRIME. Callers may remain anonymous and may qualify for a cash reward. Next time on The Fall Line, we continue with our coverage of Nashville's cold unidentified persons cases, some of the most difficult the department is facing because they are working from a single element or because the decedent's remains are gone. Special thanks to Daphne Solberg with her help on this episode with Nashville's historical information, and to the Metro Nashville Public Library System. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independently produced show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIAs, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. And if you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And take a moment to rate and review our show on your podcast app of choice. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case in the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified persons cases, is out everywhere now as hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books and through your local library. Find out more through the link in our show notes. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who've appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. Or if you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance from Brian Waters and Anna Luria. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams. And, as always, our most special thanks to Liz Lipka.